Hey there, I'm Jenson. Today is Friday, February 25th, and on Thursday, Russian forces invaded Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodomyr Zelensky says at least 137 civilians and military personnel have been killed so far in the invasion. But why exactly is Russia invading a sovereign nation? What sparked this conflict? I spoke with Kyle Rable. He's a PhD student studying military history at Texas Tech and a Northwest Ohio native to get you in the loop. First, let's take a look at what Putin is saying. For starters, Putin sees Ukrainians and Russians as one people, and he says the invasion is meant to protect the citizens of eastern Ukraine, many of whom reside in the pro-Russian separatist areas of the country. But it seems like most Ukrainians don't want to be back under Russian rule.
The Ukrainian people don't want this. And despite what Putin is saying, they are a liberal democracy elected by the people. He's on this trope that the ethnic Russians and the eastern and southeastern portions of Ukraine have asked him. This is not a fact. This is disproven. He is claiming that there has been mass genocide by the Ukrainians and the ethnically Russian-speaking people. This, again, has been proven false. His narrative about denazifying Ukraine, the president and prime minister are Jewish.
So what's really going on here? To truly understand, we need some historical context. Ukraine has had centuries of conflict over land, but this story really starts at the end of World War II. Following the war, the US and Western European forces came together to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or what most people know as NATO.
NATO is mostly, to think of it in this terms, is the allied countries plus West Germany. It's created to stabilize Europe specifically and to counter the growth of the Soviet Union. And what NATO is to the Kremlin is a allied force sitting on their border.
Most importantly, NATO members agreed to Article 5 of the treaty, which states that an attack on any NATO member is considered an attack on all members.
If you do onto one, you're doing onto all. And so what Article 5 means and why this is important is when Ukraine had applied to NATO membership, this is encroaching further and further onto the border of Russia, right? And so Putin sees this as they're gearing up in his mind and his possibly an invasion, enticing me to attack, to produce an invasion. And so Article 5 is that trigger.
But in the early 1990s, the Soviet Union began to dissolve.
What happens in the 90s, 91 is obviously when it dissolves, is there's mass confusion, worry, and hysteria. The arms that are in Ukraine, there's nuclear missiles in Ukraine in the 90s. Throughout the Cold War, it's one of the bases for nuclear missiles. And this explains why Ukraine is the way it is today. When the USSR dissolves, Ukraine turns west, gives up its nuclear arsenal, gives it to the West, and says, please protect us from Russian aggression in the future because we're doing this now. And the United States promises to support Ukraine. It's a gentleman's promise more than anything else. But it's a promise nonetheless to support Ukraine in the case of Russian aggression.
NATO began to expand, and by 2020, it added an additional 14 members, many of which were once Soviet-controlled countries. However, Ukraine isn't one of them. They've applied, and they're an ally. So why isn't Ukraine a NATO country, and why is that important to Putin?
To start off, it's important because Putin sees this as expansion of Western sphere of influence into what he thinks is traditionally his sphere of influence. Remember, this is a man that was a KGB agent. He is thinking in a Soviet mindset. So that's step number one. That's why Putin has done what he's done to a degree, and the aspect of them not being part of the NATO pact is, from my understanding, you cannot join NATO while actively in war or conducting war or anything of that nature. When they applied for NATO membership, that sparked 2014. And since then, they've been in a constant state of war and survival.
So why now?
It's not just a now thing. Putin invaded sovereign Ukraine territory in 2014, annexing Crimea and the two separatist regions. That was an invasion. Those people didn't ask him necessarily, he took it. His invasion of this is because he's afraid. NATO is there. His economy since then has collapsed almost. And that's where he's at, on the verge of this. And he launches this invasion. It's an invasion. It's not a movement. It's not anything else. He launches an invasion of the sovereign country of Ukraine, justifying it through fake propaganda methods.
Now, there are several NATO countries that are nearby Ukraine, and those neighbors have already expressed concern that Putin may turn his attention their way. They include Poland, Turkey, and the Baltics, which includes Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. In many of those cases, further expansion of Russian military action would carry heavy consequences for NATO. President Biden has already said we won't be sending troops to Ukraine, but he's issued some pretty tough sanctions on Russia. Yesterday, he said the U.S. will block assets of large Russian banks, impose export controls aimed at the nation's high-tech needs, and sanction its business oligarchs. And just hours ago, White House Press Secretary Jenson Strock said the U.S. will sanction Putin and other members of the Russian National Security Team. And Ukraine says if Russia thought they were in for an easy win, well, they're wrong. Just today, President Zelensky posted a video of himself and his cabinet saying, "We are here defending Ukraine." He's urging people to arm themselves, and that looks to be exactly what they're doing. Ukrainians took a stand on a major bridge right in front of Russian tanks, and the battle was on. But as this conflict continues, keep in mind there is a lot of misinformation out there, and don't forget the real people who are losing their lives, their families, and their homes.
Remember that there are people in Ukraine that are currently being invaded by a foreign force aggressive enough to bomb and kill innocent civilians. We haven't got the numbers yet. The fog of war is very dense. It's hard to tell what's happening, who's where, and who's doing what. Far as we can tell, the Ukrainian people, the government, the military, the civilians are fighting back against this wanton aggression by Putin. I implore people to understand that Putin has used this information to cloud the judgment of many people.
Things are changing rapidly, and to stay up to date on all the latest verified information, stick with us here on WTOL 11 on air and online. But for now, I'm Jensen, and now you're in the loop.